So the Extrudinator I've been using for a little while now. I've done quite a few prints with it and I'm really happy with it, for the most part. There are some little issues and we'll be running through those step by step, but there's one issue in particular that I want to take a look at today. So let's go through what that is and how I'm going to go about solving it. So what is this issue then? Well, fortunately it's not that major, but basically it's a bit of a usability problem. When I designed the printer, I didn't design it to have any kind of interface directly on the printer. Because I hadn't used Duet before, I wasn't familiar with the experience, and I thought just using the web interface, which I'd heard was very good, would be sufficient for controlling the printer. And for the most part it is. It is a very good web interface. So there's no actual complaints about it from that side. When I'm not at the printer, it's absolutely fine. However, when setting up a print, it's generally useful to be able to interact with it when you're standing right next to it for loading filament and things like that can't really be done remotely. So what I want to do is merge those two together. I want to be able to have the amount of control that I can get from the web interface, but while stationed at the printer. The 7i is an integrated 7-inch touchscreen panel for the Duet series of control boards. This will give me not only control at the printer, but quick control at the printer, no need for dialy knobs and silly things like that, a nice big, large, clear interface for looking at, and it just is pretty cool really, isn't it? So that's what I'm going to be using. So now we have the kind of screen that I want to use and the printer that I want to use it on. Now I've got to work out some integration, some system to hold the two together, to connect them together, to make it all function as intended. The first step in the whole design process for mounting the screen was to find a suitable position for it. So I basically took the physical screen and held it up to the printer in multiple different places just to see where I thought felt best. I didn't want to have it too wide, so like sticking out the side of the printer would have mean like if I moved the printer anywhere, like taking it to a show for example, I didn't want it to get caught on stuff and end up snapping off or breaking or anything like that. So I wanted to have it kind of within the frame as much as possible. One of the possible positions was to mount it quite high up on the frame. The downside of this is that you'd have to hold your arm in the air for using it, which is not that bad, but it also means there's a very long cable run between the control board and the actual screen itself. Now the limit is fairly long, somewhere between 400mm and 800mm, but I wanted to keep that length kind of within the shortest distance possible to prevent any potential problems. So the position I ended up settling on was right down at the front of the printer on the left hand side, which meant it was very easy to access in terms of usability. I could angle it in such a way that it would point slightly up at the user. And it also means that it's in a fairly enclosed position, so it's not sticking out the side, so it doesn't mean it's going to get caught on anything as it brushes past people if I'm carrying it around somewhere. So overall, I think that position is going to be the ideal one. Now we just need to model something that's going to hold it in place. So for the actual CAD portion of the design, I needed a reference model. So a reference model would be the model of the actual panel Duet 7i, so that I can put that into CAD and model an enclosure around it. If you've seen my Fusion 360 series on designing an enclosure for a headphone amplifier, then you'll have a good idea of what I mean. If you've not seen that, there'll be a link in the cards. So to get the reference dimensions, I first went to the Duet website, and fortunately they do have all the dimensions there. However, that would obviously mean modelling up something myself, which takes time. This is absolutely possible, and I could have done that, but I decided to also have a look for models that had already been made from those dimensions. So I found a model on GrabCAD of the 7i, which I decided to use and imported that straight into my SolidWorks model. Unfortunately here, yes, I am using SolidWorks rather than Fusion 360. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily a tutorial you can follow along that easily if you don't have SolidWorks, but I'll show you the design process I went to in order to set this all up. So in the CAD environment, the first thing I did was position the reference model that I had, the one I downloaded, into my main assembly. By putting it in the approximate position that I want to put it, I can then design the model, what we call in context, so that as you drop that part into the assembly, it's immediately in the right position instead of having to drag it around and position it and use mates and all that kind of stuff. I used a fairly similar design process to what I did in my headphone amplifier series for Fusion 360, where I basically created a box around the screen and then shelled it and cut parts out, put some posts in to be able to screw into to mount the screen, and then did a cover over the back in order to cover electronics from any loose fingers that are flying around. If your fingers are flying around, you should probably get that checked. The design overall was fairly simple, and I've set it up to be printed flat on the kind of screen face to give one, a smooth finish, And also, I think that was the best angle in order to print to reduce the amount of overhangs and stuff that are going to be printed. Definitely the most challenging part of the model was to make sure that the mounting points to the frame have a face that's not going to impact with the motion of the bed, while also being attached to the main body and also being still printable. So I had to get that overhang angle just right to be able to print, and it also doesn't use supports, which is nice. After spending a few hours with the CAD design, I decided to print out a version to see if my thoughts and ideas would work out how I expected them to. So this is the first design that I printed out, obviously 2 large parts, and then there's some smaller parts for the buttons as well. I ended up not using the buttons because I found out that you don't actually really need to be pressing these very often. They're like reset buttons and things like that. So basically you need to be able to press them when you absolutely need to, but you don't need them to be easily accessible with just finger tap buttons. So I decided to do away with that and just move to small holes where I can stick like a pen through just to tap the button if I need to. The overall screen kind of hole here was not the right size. It ended up not quite perfect, so that had to change. I also found that there was quite a lot of empty room on the inside. There was kind of lots of space in here that just wasn't needed. So I decided to reduce the width of the whole thing, which also gave me a little bit of adjustability on the printer frame for where it could actually sit. There you can see this small cutout at the back is for the cable to run from this point here. The ribbon cable can run up here, kind of fold over itself and come out over here. That will then go into the frame where it can go to the control board. There's a number of small holes positioned here for the kind of speaker behind that just beeps at you really loudly. And then a small cutout also at the bottom for an SD card. This was kind of okay, but not ideal. It wasn't that easy to get to the SD card, and it was easy to get to parts that you didn't need to. So that hole just basically needed to move down a little bit to give access to the right area. So this is the second version, and it's fairly similar to the first. It is very much narrower. I accidentally removed this hole at the back, and that's a bit of a theme through the design process. So that will come back at some point, but not quite yet. All the small holes that were here for the speaker ended up really not printing very well at all. The small holes that were top and bottom for the buttons, that ended up also not printing very great. But this new cutout at the front for the SD card, that was positioned just right. Again, still didn't manage to get the screen enclosure quite right, so that was not perfect. This is the third design that I printed, and this didn't go well. So this I printed on the Prusa i3 Mark III, and unfortunately this is what kind of killed off my printer. Obviously it can be repaired, it's not a big deal, but basically it didn't really work. And that ended up as a bit of a disaster, and I've got parts to replace that. For the next design, we've moved over to a different printer, up onto the Extrudinator itself. On this iteration, the print was a little bit less good in terms of overall print quality. It went back onto the Extrudinator, and this was a material that I'd not particularly calibrated yet, so overall finish was not very good. There's some obvious problems with overhangs and kind of curling, which doesn't look particularly great. The base surface finish doesn't look super brilliant because I think the offset between the nozzle and the bed was not quite right. The features in the holes, they don't look great, but I think they'll function just fine. But overall, functionally, this was fairly good. So I decided to mount it to the printer, where I encountered some very noticeable issues. So I removed it, and then everything worked exactly perfectly as it should have done. So obviously this was the problem. And I realized that without having a brim on the inside, the plastic was touching the screen. And because it's not a capacitive screen, it's a pressure sensitive screen, this was basically randomly pressing all the buttons on the screen like at the same time or something. So it was basically doing a whole load of stuff as the printer was turning on and causing an absolute mess of the configuration. To solve that issue, I went onto this version, which you can see is incomplete, but it does have a small brim around the inside of the printer where the screen can go very close to the kind of bezel, if you like, but it doesn't actually touch it. So it means that the enclosure won't be pressing buttons randomly on the screen, which is really useful. I also made a couple of changes to the radius here on the screen, just because I thought the previous one was a little bit large and looked a little bit not that pleasant. I also changed the hole pattern for the speaker to be slightly larger holes so they were a little bit easier to print. Other than that, virtually the same. So you might question then, if this one was going really well, why I've stopped it halfway through. Well, that's a good question, and it would appear that I don't really have a good answer. Basically, my brain just was absolutely fried. I came in fairly late in the evening to check on it. I was like, I've got this like light switch that I turned on next to the printer. I was like, okay, that's good. is going really, really well. And I just reached behind the printer and turned it off. What I meant to do, of course, was to turn off the light and then leave the room. What I actually did was just turn off the printer halfway through printing. So that's why that one's half completed. This was very near to being the final version, but I'd neglected the fact that the cutout in the back for the cable was still not present. And then this doesn't sit quite straight, so you need something to be able to get the cable in, while this can still mount kind of squarely and strongly to the frame. This was almost perfect. It actually works exactly as intended, apart from this cutout. So here we have the final version, and I think it looks absolutely fan-dabby-tastic. So we've got, of course, the larger grille cutout for the speaker, 2 clear buttons that you can actually see the little red buttons beneath it. If I ever need to touch them, probably won't need to. The screen is perfectly kind of aligned to the cutout, so there's no like visible bezel or anything like that. The radius in the corners is nice and small, so it doesn't prevent you touching buttons in the corner of the screen. The print finish looks reasonably good. I did actually scratch it a little bit by accident with my deburring tool as I took the brim off it, but other than that, I'm really happy with how this has turned out. The backside is still printed in this, well, it's a clear PETG, but it comes out basically white because it does. So that's the whole CAD and print side done. Now we've got to actually, obviously, integrate it into the printer. For this, there's only really 2 things you need to do. Firstly was the cable. Now the cable that comes with it, I think, was about 300mm long, and that was a little bit short for me. I couldn't quite get it to reach to where I needed it to be, whilst also making sure that the cable was suitably managed and not weirdly stretched. So I decided to make my own cable. Now I already have the cable, the ribbon cable and the connectors that I needed. I just needed to make sure that I didn't cut it too long, that would cause problems, and not too short that it still wouldn't be long enough. So I ended up, I think, with a length around 450mm, which I basically just cut, put connectors on the end, making sure they were the exact same alignment as the original cable, and then plugged it in to test it. The last part of this is obviously making sure that the Duet works well with the screen. And fortunately, the configuration for that was exceptionally easy. By that I mean there was no configuration. I basically plugged it in at one end, plugged it in at the other end, turned it on, and it worked. So if you are wondering about getting a screen and thinking, oh, it's going to probably be really complicated to set up, I'm not sure I'm going to manage it, you'll manage it just fine. You just plug it in and it works. So now when I'm standing at my extrudinator, changing filament, turning on heaters, temperatures and all things like that, I can actually do all that control straight off the control panel. It is really responsive, it's really easy to use. I would probably personally change some of the layout, and maybe we'll look at doing that in a future video. But other than that, I mean, it's so much better than just not having anything, and it's also so much better than things like little twizzly knobs with those old pixelated LCDs. Oh, so much better. What surprises me is the responsiveness. Like, it's really, really quick. If you go tip, 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 then it does it. It's not like hit and wait for it to load, and then it's really, really responsive. So one big thing that I don't like about it, and probably something that I can change, but I've not found out how to yet, is to be able to sort the order of the files on the SD card by like last date modified or something like that, so that they're in kind of a chronological order rather than alphabetical order. This has changed my workflow a bit in that I normally delete files off the Duet board when I'm not using them, as opposed to just loading them on and just watching them all just gather up. It's probably better that way, to be honest, because it means I can clear them off regularly rather than just let them all stack up. But anyway, that's one thing that I would like to see, just because it means that if you've just put a file over there, then you know it's just going to be right at the top, which is super, super convenient, rather than having 50 files and having to search through pages and having to remember the file name and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's probably my only one comment in terms of things I would change about it. So that's it from me today on my Extrudinator upgrade. Thank you very much to Duet 3D for providing the panel used in this project. Thank you very much to you for watching. Subscribe and like if you want to see more, and I shall see you in the next one.